Right, great. Thank you very much, Lauren. Thanks for having us. Let me share my screen here so we can get started. Um, like Lauren said, I'm going to present to you just sort of an introductory course on reserve studies for board members. Usually we're giving this presentation to property managers like Julie or Lauren, but it's good to meet the board directly and talk to you guys. So thanks for having us. Let me see how I get. All right. ONS Engineers and Architects, just a little bit about us. We are, like I said, engineers and architects. We specialize in the restoration and renewal of existing facilities. So our primary objective is to work on buildings like yours in the built environment, existing buildings, repairing them, restoring them, doing studies for them. So we're always working with residential associations, residential communities, working on your buildings and actually fixing them with you. We've been in business since 1997, so we've got a long track record. We have, my office is in Blue Bell, Pennsylvania. We also have an office in Somerset, New Jersey, office in Hackensack, New Jersey, an office in Manhattan, one in DC, Columbus, Ohio, and Miami. So we do a lot of work in the Mid-Atlantic region here, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and really all the way up and down the East Coast. So to jump right into what we're talking about here, reserve studies. What's the goals? The goals here are to sort of understand what is a reserve study and why do you do it? What you should expect from your reserve study. How do you go about soliciting for a reserve study? So when you want to hire somebody, how do you find a good person or a good company to do a reserve study? Not necessarily ONS Associates. There's a lot of good companies out there that do this, but making sure that you understand how to go buy that service. And then ultimately, how do you use the information that we give you? At the end of this, you get a big report and you need to know what that's good for. So those are the goals that I want to try to get to here, and hopefully I can answer your questions. So what is it? Really, a reserve study is it's a capital budgeting planning tool. It evaluates, what do you guys own? You have a condominium association, whether it's a high-rise building or it's a townhouse association. What do you as the association own that you're responsible for replacing and taking care of? How much does that stuff cost? You know, I mean, you look at, you have different components. You might have heaters, you might have roofs, you have siding. Understanding how much does it cost when it comes time for you to replace that component. How much is it going to cost you as an association to shell out to a contractor and an engineer to design it to replace that? And ultimately, that tells us how much money should you as the association be saving in your reserves. So you have a reserve. Usually you come and you've started with some sort of reserve allotment that's been set up for you by the sponsor or by the developer. And depending on how mature your association is, you need to update that regularly to know, are we saving enough money? Do we have enough money in the bank? When we need to do these large scale projects, are we going to be able to fund that with the money that we have saved? Or are we going to need to go out and do some sort of special assessment? So the reserve study gives you the tools, the information that you need to know. What do you own? How much does that cost? And do we have enough money to pay for that? Why do you do it? I ask myself with all these different obligatory reports and things that we have to produce. And at the end, a lot of people say, hey, I'd rather spend money on doing the work rather than getting a report done for it, right? I'm in agreement with you on that most of the time. But there's a lot of reasons why we do a reserve study. You know, you have fiduciary responsibility as a board member. You have to meet this for your constituents, for the people who live in your association as your responsibility. It enhances a resale value. I think, especially now as our buyers are becoming more educated on what the condominium association or homeowners association is and the obligations that they have. And certainly there's a lot of news out there about condominiums and maybe underfunding. People are paying attention to say, how much money does that condominium association, homeowners association have in the bank to pay for this kind of stuff? And is it enough? So when new buyers are looking at buying a home from one of your current owners, they're looking at this information and it can really enhance the resale value. Or contrarily, it can really damage the resale value if you don't have enough money in reserves and people identify that you have a lot of outstanding liabilities. It's the planning tool. You guys are the responsible party for maintaining and taking care of your the stuff that you own. So this is a tool to help you do that. Really, the ultimate goal here is to kind of minimize special assessments. Nobody wants to go out to the group and say, hey, we didn't plan for roof replacement on all of these buildings, and now everybody's got to come up with $10,000. We want to minimize the potential adverse reactions that you're going to get from your owners when you go and ask for those types of monies. It normalizes the payments between the old and the new buyers. I know maybe some people don't want to do that all the time. There's often I go into meetings and I listen to people and they'll say, hey, why should I save for a roof? I'm not going to be here when that roof needs to get replaced. Well, that's not really fair or equitable to the other owners or to the new owners. So this is a tool to sort of make that a little bit more fair in the normalization of who's paying for things. And you have to disclose this to buyers. Almost all, actually, the Pennsylvania and New Jersey law requires that if a potential buyer asks for this information, it has to be disclosed to them. And in fact, I think you have to disclose that to them regardless of whether they ask for it or not. So you have to do these things. Who says we have to do it? Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Maryland, there's no statutory requirement that says you have to do a reserve study. It's not in there. Delaware does have a statutory requirement from the state that says that they have to have a fully funded reserve. And there's 30 other states that do mandate it. There's other things like if you're going for FHA or HUD funding, if your buyers are trying to get a loan for their property, those lenders may require that they have a reserve and they may require certain amounts of it to be funded. And as an association, your insurance company often requires that you have reserve fundings, and they can set a limit, and that may drastically affect the insurance that you're paying on your association. And again, we're trying to avoid the special assessment. We don't want to go out there and come up short at the end of the year or when we have to do these projects and have you guys like Lauren and Julie have to send out notices to everybody and say, come on guys, we're going to have to come up with a whole bunch of money next year. So what do you expect from a reserve study? What should you expect for this? There's a lot of technical information in it, but really you should expect that whoever you hire to do your reserve study will identify all of the components that you own that are reserve components. There's limits on what we call a reserve component, but it's always my goal in a reserve study is to identify as much of the common components, the things that you'll have to pay for as possible, and record that and document that information so you have a long inventory of what it is you own, what you're going to be responsible for, and what you're going to have to pay for. And what is the replacement cost of that? I think what's really important here is to consider this as a project cost. You guys are dealing with a larger scale property than just a home, so as a homeowner, you have a roof to replace. As a association, you have a lot of roofs to replace. So there's other costs that go into that. You need to consider that. I look to project cost. I can tell you that almost every reserve study that I see is underfunded for projects. So if we go in there and they say, hey, we got to replace furnaces in these, or let's say you have an air handler unit on a roof or something like that, the reserve study may only account for the direct replacement of that piece of equipment and doesn't necessarily take into account all the ancillary costs. We might have to, get a crane in there and lift something up to a roof, or we have to take a fence out so that we can get to the back of a property. The reserve study really should be looking at these things like a project and tell you what it's really going to cost you to do that project, not just necessarily replacing one single piece of equipment. So it's important to look at this. Your reserve study should be giving you good, accurate information as to what things cost for you to actually do in the real world. In our reserve studies, we offer condition assessments. So we're looking at your components, we're looking at your property, we're looking at the equipment, and we're assessing whether it is in the condition that it should be. So if you have a hot water heater that theoretically should last 15 years, but it's in really bad condition because it's rusting, or maybe you had a flood in the room, your reserve analysis should be able to look at that and say, industry standard says it should last me 15 years, but you're probably going to need to replace this in 2 years. So it's important to have a reserve study personnel who can look at that component, do a real condition assessment on it, and really tell you how long is that thing going to last. We get to what is this? When we finish this report and we hand it over to you, and now it's yours to use, in essence, it's a big spreadsheet. It's a big spreadsheet with maybe some written description of what we're looking at, a picture of representative samples of what that component is. But really, it's a big spreadsheet that gives you financial information as to the things we just talked about. What do you own? How much does it cost? And when do you need to replace it? So that's the physical thing that we sort of hand to you at the end of this report. The big part of this is understanding, and we'll talk about this in a little bit when we talk about how to solicit and how to ask for us to do that, is to have a good understanding of what you want out of this. How detailed do you want this report to be? How much information do you want in it? How long of a time frame do you want to look for? If you're looking at this, typically a report will go out for 20 years. We project for replacement of components for 20 years. But in reality, you have a lot of things in your association, on your property, that might last more than 20 years. And making sure that your report is going to keep that in there. If you think of like concrete, your concrete curbs and your concrete sidewalks or things like that, they should probably last more than 20 years, but they still are accruing a depreciation that you need to consider for, and make sure that when you're looking for a capital reserve study, you're considering how long of a period are we looking out for these replacement components. Really importantly is to understand what you're not going to get here, right? This is not construction documents. These are not finished documents that, Julia and Lauren can take and hand to a contractor and say, hey, contractor X, do this in year 2023 because this report says it. That's not what this is. This is a financial guidance tool for you guys to use, but it's not designing replacement or repair programs for you. And it's not an absolute tool. I mean, it's not something that I would look at and say, here, use this specifically for this component. It is not, the engineer or the architect that you hire to do this for you is not doing a really thorough analysis or investigation of all of the components. We're not opening up equipment and testing it. We're not determining whether it's, the appropriate design for its usage. If you have a generator, we're not doing an analysis to determine if you should have more capacity to that generator. We're also not looking at things, unless you ask us to, to determine whether you should be upgrading that equipment. You know, typically the reserve analysis is looking at a component and saying, I'm going to replace this on a one-for-one basis. Exactly what was there, I'm going to put in what is the replacement for that right now. So we need to consider, or you need to consider as the board and as the property managers, is do we need to make this better than it was? And if you need to make it better than it was, you need to make sure that that's what you're asking for from your reserve, capital reserve engineer architect, right? And it's not a punch list. You know, so a punch list is going around. We're not looking at every little tiny component. We're not looking at all the little intricacies of the things that you have at your building. We're looking at the larger scale things. We're looking at, you know, are they there? Not necessarily, I have a crack in the wall, or I have a crack in drywall, or this carpet in this area isn't really holding up well. This is looking at it more on a global scale. So it's not a punch list, and it's certainly not something that is to be used to go back to talk to a contractor to try to get them to come out and fix something for you after the fact. That's not what a reserve study is. Also, it's not a guarantee. You know, a lot of it, and I talk about this because it's important to understand that the information that you get out of this is based upon the information that's put in. So it's making sure that you provide good, reliable direction and guidance and information to your engineer or architect, and that you're hiring a very good engineer or architect to do this for you. Because at the end of the day, when you come to that project and you don't have enough money for it, or that component fails 5 years before you expected it to, and now all of a sudden you got to do a major boiler upgrade or something that's, or a roof replacement that's a lot more expensive than you thought, there's no guarantee behind this. You know, engineers and architects, we try to do our best on it, but you don't go back on it and say, you didn't leave enough money in there for us, and now somebody owes us for that. So this is not a guarantee or a warranty. It's providing you information, and we'll talk about how to ask for that information and how to make sure you're getting good information. We talk about how to buy this. You know, we've talked a little about hiring a great engineering firm, but understanding when you need a reserve study, how do you go out and solicit for it? How do you direct your property managers, Julia or Lauren, to go out and find engineers for you? There's different levels of service of a reserve study, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. It's highly dependent on how big your association is. You know, there's a big difference between a high-rise association or a homeowner association with hundreds of units and one that has 5 or 6. You know, you need to consider the size of your association. How old are you? I mean, how old is the association? How old are the buildings that you're in? If they're brand new, likely you don't have a lot of replacement components that are coming of age right now. If you're 20 years old, that's in the sweet spot right there. Everything is coming due, and you need to be expectant that we're spending a lot more time assessing the conditions of those components. Where are you located? You know, are you in the city, or you're out in a rural area? And obviously, who are you partnering up here to work with? I talked briefly about the level of service. So reserve studies are broken into 3 different types based upon the level of service. A full is us as the engineer and architect. We come out and we look at, we inventory everything that you have, we assess everything that you have, we cost estimate it, and we provide you with the financial information. An update, a level 2 reserve study is we don't inventory it. We count on that first one that was done maybe 5 years ago, and we're just coming out, re-looking at the components, making sure they're in similar condition as what they should be expected, and we're updating that reporting for you. And a level 3 is we're not even coming out to your building. We're literally just taking the old report, we're changing the dates on it, we're giving it back to you, and you guys tell us what programs have you already finished, We update that a little bit and give it to you. So when you're sending out an RFP or you're asking architects and engineers for a reserve study, it's very important to understand what level of a reserve study do I need, because I can tell you the cost difference for our services between these is night and day. We can do a level 3 sitting at a desk in a couple of hours, and it really takes very little time or effort, and it's not going to cost you a lot of money. And a level 1 is going to cost quite a bit more money, because we're going to have engineers and architects on the ground at your building, inventorying everything. So understanding, what are you asking for? What do you need? And how much money do you want to spend on that? When you get into this, a level 1 study is one that you need to do for your first one without a doubt. You can't get around that. After that, if you have a really good study that's been completed for you in the past, you can do a level 2 or a level 3 after that. Make sure you're picking a good partner in this. When you're buying a reserve study, you're buying my time and my effort as an engineer or an architect. You're just basically buying time. So you're selecting and you're partnering up with people. So my advice is to choose that wisely. Be careful about who you're partnering up with, because those are the people you're going to have to work with. I look at them to see what experience do they have doing this type of work. Are they engineers and architects who understand reserve studies, specialize in reserve studies, really work in this industry? Or are they people that just doing this to kind of fill the cracks in their business model, right? And they just do a reserve study every once in a while when somebody asks them to. Do they have the expertise to do it? Are they flexible? You guys are the owners. You guys are the ones who need to kind of push the path of understanding what you want out of this. And your AE or architect engineer partner should be flexible to provide you with what you need, not to make up information for you, but to tailor this report to make sure it's something that works for you. And are they local? Are these people who are local to you? Are they out of town? If they're out of town, they're going to be a lot less serviceable to you if they got to come back to the building for something. If they're local, they can help you in a lot of different ways. They can swing by and check things out for you. Another thing I always say is figure out who in that AE firm is actually going to be doing the work for you. I'm a professional engineer. I have almost 25 years of experience. I'm the principal of our firm. I manage 2 offices. The reality is I'm not going to be the one out there on the ground doing the assessment for you, right? So you, as the board members or the decision makers, need to make sure that you're meeting with the people who are actually going to be doing the work, and not necessarily just the salespeople and the high-level people at the company who are the face of the company. So there's nothing wrong with saying, hey, send out your person for an interview or something like that who's actually going to be doing this work. You want to meet that person. They're going to be the ones, people are behind them and they help them with the expertise, but you want to make sure you know who's actually doing that work. And, your expectations for this. We get into a lot of reserve studies, and this is where establishing a really good RFP or request for proposal is important. You're asking us as an engineer and architect to provide you a service, to provide you a deliverable. We have to make sure that our expectations are aligned, right? So you guys, you know what you want. Make sure that we both are on the same page before we start this. We want to set those expectations. And as an engineering firm, I expect you guys to demand what you bought. At the end of this, I want you to get what you paid for, to get what you asked for, to get the appropriate thing delivered to you. There's nothing that drives me more crazy than to lose out on a project to another engineering firm, another architecture firm, because they cost a little bit less than us. And then at the end of the day, the property manager comes back to us and says, oh, they didn't do a good job and it wasn't really what we wanted. And I say, well, then why didn't you make them fix the project, fix fix the report, do it right for you. Set your expectations appropriately and make sure that you hold your engineers and your architects accountable for what you're asking them for. That goes both ways. You know, you also have to be reasonable. If you're not asking for the right thing and they're giving you, and at the end you say, oh, but I wanted more than that, that's not setting the right expectations both ways. And then finally, we get down to, how do we use this tool when we're finished with it? Like I said, we're going to give you a big report at the end. Part of your deliverable might be us coming out there and telling you, having a meeting with the board or having a meeting with, whoever might be in charge of the project for you to present our findings to you, to talk to you about it, to go over it a couple times and maybe refine it so that it fits into what you need. But at the end, you're going to get this report. And how are you going to use it? So there's a big difference in the reporting that you're going to get. And you guys, the property managers, can probably tell you that most of the reports you get, and all of a sudden it says, hey, we don't have nearly enough money, right? We're not fully funded at all. That doesn't mean that, everybody should pack up and run for the hills. It means that you just have to figure out how you're going to work with this. I look at this and I say, on this slide, it's, the ideal scenario is, hey, we're fully funded. We don't have to defer any work. We don't have to make any special assessments. We can do every project that we ever wanted to do. Reality is that doesn't happen. You have some level of funding there, and we can work with you to establish a threshold funding level, which means, hey, you're funding, you want to fund to this much money. You want to have at least this much so that we can avoid disaster. And then we want to try to improve from there. We want to sit down with you and understand, if you don't have enough money to do everything you were supposed to do in 2022, what can we defer? What can we push out to a later year? Is there ways that we can maintain that component instead of replacing it so that it costs you less money this year? And ultimately coming up with planned budgeting. How are you going to do this? There's the shock of seeing these things. I find can often, when people think that they're just grossly underfunded, and oftentimes that they say, oh, the past board didn't do a good job. They kind of left us in the lurch. That shock of being underfunded sort of paralyzes people to making good decisions and moving forward with what they have. Ultimately, you're setting a budget, right? How much money should your community be spending? How much money does your community have? This is the value of your community. This is really what gets at your resale values. It really keeps your communities, as they get older, from becoming aged, dilapidated condominium or homeowners associations. None of us want that to occur, because we know it doesn't make it a desirable place for us to live. And it certainly doesn't make it a desirable place for future people to buy from us. So we're setting a budget as how you're going to continue to manage this property and improve it over time. How do we budget that? This is part of the reserve sort of deliverable. And I think this is where having a really good AE partner to sit down with after the fact is to establish these priorities. After you get a reserve study and you know how much money you really need versus how much money you have, you need to sit down and have those hard conversations. You need to say, now we need to prioritize things. We need to figure out what we can push off, what we need to do. That's coming up with these prioritizations, sitting down with your engineer, having them give you the information that you need so you can make good decisions. Understanding your risk. We go into all different types of condominium associations. They can tell you that some of the very high-end, high-rise buildings in Philadelphia where the rich people live, the athletes of the world, they don't want a whole lot of money in the bank, because when they need to raise some money, they can go to people and say, hey, you got an assessment. They have a pain threshold that is higher than the average person, right? You have to understand what is your associations, what are your constituents' pain threshold. If you go to them and ask them for $5,000, how many of them can come up with $5,000, right? having a big store of money in your association's reserve account is not a very good place to save money as a saving vehicle, right? I guess you guys can probably attest to this. You're not doing fancy investments with it. You're not putting in the stock market that has risks. You're putting in it someplace and maybe it's returning 1% on that. So there's a balance between having a whole heck of a lot of money in there and having no money in there. And that's your pain threshold as the association to determine how much do you really need to have in there. We got to update this regularly. You know, people take it and they say, okay, every 5 years we'll pull this out of a drawer and take a look at it. But I think you should be doing that more often. I think you should be asking us as engineers and architects to give you the tools to be able to maybe update it on your own so that you don't necessarily have to hire an outside consultant and pay them money. You should be able to look at it and update this so that you know where you are year after year on how much money you have, how much money you have to spend. And all of that sort of lends to a roadmap for success. Even if you start and you're grossly underfunded, there's a way to get to a good funding scenario, a good situation for how much money you have in the bank versus how much money you're going to owe. And that's just putting a good plan together between you, the board, your property managers, and your constituents, and your engineer architect firm who's helping you put this report together. How often should you be updating this? I think from hiring an outside consultant, you should be doing it about every 3 to 5 years. 5 years at the longest time frame there. We do a report for you in 3 years. Theoretically, we should be back out there doing a level 2 or a level 3 report for you to get that updated. And really, if you continue to do that every 3 years, I think it's cost effective because you're not doing as many level 1 reports, which cost a lot. You're getting really good updated information. Hopefully you're keeping up with the work that you're supposed to be doing. And if you're not, then we understand, we have a much better understanding if you look at it more often than if you wait a long time to do it. After you do major replacements, if you do a major program, you can bring somebody in to do a level 3 update for you that will just update this financial tool for you and say, hey, we replaced the most expensive components here prematurely. We put a program together, give us a new funding outlook. Somebody can come in there and really update that for you quickly. And of course, if you add something, a lot of associations we're working with now are looking as to how can they add amenities? How can they make this association or this property more desirable for the people living here or for potential buyers? And when you do that, for example, say you add a pool house or you add some sort of, large scale playground or something like that. At that time, we should be updating this, adding those components into this study so that you have a new updated understanding of what you own versus what you have in the bank. All right. Let's see. So I guess I went a little quick there. I don't know where we are on time, guys, but that's a little bit of the summary of where we're looking at. What do they do? What to expect from it? How I think you should buy it, how I recommend you buy it, and how do you use it when you finally have this information. So if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to take that now, or if you have any that are written down.
So there was one question that came in the chat. It was earlier in the presentation you spoke about doing a reserve study that goes out 20 years. And what is the advantage, or what is the reason why you would do 20 years versus 30 years like some other associations do?
Well, I actually recommend a 20-year time frame on the financials, right? 20 years is an awful long time when you're looking at financials for an association or for any owner. When we work in the commercial environment, commercial entities are looking 5 years maximum. They're not going to look any further than that because they know that things change so much between now and then. I think a 20-year outlook for an association is very appropriate, but I would ask whoever's doing your reserve analysis to include components that will last more than 20 years. A lot of engineers and architects, when they're building that inventory, they're only looking at things that fall in that 0 to 20-year time frame. And like I said, there's a lot of components at your facilities that might last for 50 years. And you're depreciating the value over that full 50 years, and you should start saving for it now, or at least understand what you might owe on it. So I think when we're looking at the spreadsheet and we have that financial information in front of us, 20 years is plenty. We don't even want to think any further than that. But understanding, hey, I own stuff that lasts more than 20 years, and that should be included in this. It's sort of a two-part answer there, I guess. Hope I didn't confuse it even further.
Well, that made sense. There was a question regarding the frequency. I believe you did clarify every 3 to 5 years, which is standard practice within the association. So there's another question that came in. It says, when you do a level 1 study, are you counting on the client to identify all the components?
So no, a level 1 study, you're counting on us to identify all of the components. Now, you can certainly help us in a lot of ways with good construction documents, depending on how old your facility is. If you have reports that were done by previous people, a level 1 study is your architect or engineer going out there and doing an inventory of what you own. So these people should be spending time walking around, looking at everything you own, making sure that they're creating that inventory. Now, I'll preface that with, you have to have somebody who knows where things are. I have done more reserve studies where we go around and the building engineer or somebody doesn't even know really what they have. And you need to be able to point me in the direction of, okay, we've got eight common furnaces. Well, you need to take me and show me all 8 of those, unless you have construction documents that would tell me where they are. So you do kind of need to help us in making sure that we're creating that full inventory for you, but really the development of that inventory is our responsibility in a level 1 study.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions? Feel free to unmute yourself or put them into the chat.
So for those completely unfamiliar with the industry.
Hi, Jeff. I have a question. I actually have 2 questions.
Okay.
So the first is, we're actually looking to get a reserve study scheduled for next year. Is it preferable to stay with the same company that's done the previous one if you don't think you have any issues with them, or is it better to go with someone else to sort of get a variety and make sure that anything that might have gotten missed or was incorrect doesn't get replicated?
Well, I think if you had somebody who gave you good service and you were happy with the deliverable that they gave you, my recommendation is always to stay with them. Stick with that person. They have sort of an institutional knowledge of your facility. Hopefully you've worked with them continuously. They should know what you have. They should be more in tune with what the problems are that you have. They may have been in contact with your property manager over the time being. They know what's out there. They know it better. So if you're satisfied, if they've delivered you a good report, it's proven to be good for you, then I would certainly encourage you to stick with that professional. We are professionals. We're selling our time and our effort. It's not a commodity type service. It's not like buying shingles for roof replacement that you can just buy for the best cost. If they've delivered you a good product, I would stay with them because they have the most institutional knowledge of your facility. If they haven't done a good job and you're not satisfied, or the report, when you've pulled it out of the desk and you've tried to do programs and the costs aren't correct, and the things are failing earlier than they anticipated for you, then it's time to start looking for somebody else to do this reporting for you. But I also think you can get a much better, if you have a good level 1 reserve study from a good firm, that firm can do a good level 2 or level 3 for you. I am always very hesitant and reluctant to do a level 2 or a level 3 on top of a study that wasn't done by us. And I think almost all AE firms are like that, because I wasn't there for it. I don't know who did it. I don't know how much effort they really put into it. I don't know how accurate it was, and I'm hesitant to count on that. So in short,
okay. And then thank you for that. And then I have a second question. What type of information, assuming we go with the same one, would be useful to give to them when they start the new review? And one of the things I was thinking is, we've had components that have failed that we've replaced. We've had issues, say, with roofs that we put out thousands of dollars, every year unexpected, that are well before their performed lifetime. Is that information that we could give to them and say, hey, this spa heater, was replaced 5 years ago, so don't spec it that it's been here for 10 years. And oh, by the way, we have history problems with roofs. You may not assume that they're going to live, the normal 25 or 30 or 35 years. How do you distinguish? Is that useful? And how do you distinguish?
Any upfront information you can give us, especially if you've done replacements, we want to know that. If you've done significant preventative maintenance on something, that's intended to sort of extend the life expectancy of it. We want to know that. To give us that information, we can evaluate whether we think it actually extended the life of it or not, but share that information with us. And if you're having acute problems with something, certainly you got to tell us, if a furnace isn't working, but you've had problems with it over the winter time and we're looking at it in the summer, we're not going to really have any idea unless you tell us that you had issues with it. And if you have roofing failures that are, recurring throughout, let us know that, and we can figure that into our life expectancy that we want to continue to assign to what that thing is, because it will have an effect. But yeah, I would share as much of that information as you can with them. It could save them some time in doing the report. And if you save us time and how much time we have to spend out there on site looking at things, we have more time to spend in the office doing assessment analysis on it, better cost estimating on it. So if you can give us information up front, we will use that to our advantage to give you a better report.
Okay, thank you.
Sanjay, did you have a question?
I did. Hi, Andy. First of all, I think your presentation was extremely effective and very easy to understand for people who are not familiar with, reserve studies. On that note, my question relates to pricing of reserve studies, whether you have any kind of rules of thumb as to how to get good value or pricing structures from reserve studies, the various levels. Frankly, in all candor, I've never dealt with this, so I wouldn't know what a good cost of a reserve study is from anything.
Mm-hmm. Well, it really varies widely. So, and let's just go with a good reserve study. I'd never recommend somebody to go out and get a cheap reserve study. So you're talking a good reserve study, but that still varies a tremendous amount based upon the size, the complexion, the type of your association.
Okay. Large, high-rise, to make it clear.
So if you're, a reserve study for, couple hundred unit high-rise unit could cost, $15,000-$20,000, whereas for a smaller HOA association that just has a handful of common amenities, even a level 1 could be, in the $5,000 range. So there's a big variable in there. And how I would recommend you do it is to put together have your property managers, and certainly we can help you with that. We can give you guide RFPs that say, here's what we think you should be asking for. You tailor it, make it any way you want. But that way you're going to a couple of different engineers and architects and saying, this is what we want. Now, please propose upon that. That way, when you evaluate where that cost is, because I know fee is important. I hope you're not making all your decisions for architects, engineers just based on fee, but I know it's a part of it. That way, at least you're comparing apples to apples instead of, you know, this company's offering just a little bit of something and this company's offering a heck of a lot. Well, obviously they have a way different fee proposal for that. So a good RFP to say, this is what we want proposed based on that will let you evaluate, you know, whose pricing is higher.
Thank you.
So we did have another question come in the chat. It says, specific to roofing, we've had issues in the past with our reserve study because the inspector used generally expected lifetimes versus walking the roof. What should we expect as typical?
Well, typically in a reserve study, the assessor is not getting on the roof, especially a sloped roof, to look at it. If you want that, you put that in your RFP. And I'll tell you, that costs us, you know, we're engineers and architects. We're not roofers. I don't have a truck. I have a Mazda 6. I don't have a big ladder on that thing. I now have to get a contractor, or you guys have to provide a contractor to come out there, put a ladder up. Hopefully it's a roof that isn't a terrible degree that I can actually walk up and look at the valleys and look at the flashing. If you want that, and especially if you have issues with the roof, if you think you have problems with it, work with the engineer or architect to say, these are things we have specific concerns about. What can you do more to assess this for us so we have a better confidence level in how long that component is going to last for us? But if you're just asking blanket out and say, hey, give us a reserve study, and you have asphalt shingle roofs, typically I would not expect the reserve assessor to go out there, put a ladder up, and get on your roofs. They're going to look at it from the ground. They're going to see if they can see any obvious deficiencies, which obviously it's hard to do. And then they're going to determine the life expectancy of that roof based upon either information you gave them or just how old is it and what type of shingle.
Wonderful. Does anyone else have any questions? Probably have time for one more. We are coming up upon 7 o'clock. All right, well, thank you again, Andy, for joining us this evening. This was very informative. We did record this session. Should you want to circulate this to your fellow board members, just have them reach out to your property manager and they'll be able to provide the link. We will be circulating a new calendar for 2022 for all of our board roundtables and continuing education. So we thank you all for your participation this year and have a wonderful holiday season. Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.